to our sixth acceleration and our first in-person meetup. And thanks to our special guest, Praveen and Raja, who is also going to speak today. We are following all the COVID protocols. You might have seen all of us masked up. We'll give exceptions to the speakers so that you can see their faces as well when they speak. We'll get started with a welcome note by our CTO, GK.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks everyone for making it in person. We actually always wanted to have the space be used for meetups, live meetups, and that's one of the reasons we designed it like this. But of course, COVID came and we were doing our accelerations in a remote manner. We are mainly doing this, we did our first acceleration back here in IIT Madras Research Park about a year and a half ago. Actually, I believe we met Raja, one of the speakers today, actually in the meetup, if I'm not mistaken, for Golang. So reason we want to do this, make sure we reach back out to the community, give something back to the community, also get to network with people. And so thanks everyone for showing up. So we have a couple of awesome topics, pretty exciting ones. Thanks to Praveen. He's leading the Hexer factory and has pretty long experience in somewhat of this niche area, right? Which is so. I'm excited to for all of us to hear from him on what he thinks is critical for this mixed reality. And Raja has been one of our amazing engineers. So he's going to talk about Rust. Rust as a technology platform we actually considered to be adopted into Toyota a few years ago, but we couldn't do it at that time. But now our teams are actually leveraging it for our next generation connected car platform. So it's exciting to see that's coming to mainstream within Toyota and see how people are going to use it. So I hope you all enjoy the session. We're also expecting more participants here who will come and join, but we'll get the session started. So once again, thanks to the speakers and organizers. I'll let, without much further ado, I'll give it to Praveen to start his session. Thanks, Praveen.
Thank you. I think I'm good. Good evening, everybody. I'm actually excited to be here as well. Thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm actually excited. So I'm Praveen Raj Jayachandran. So I'm the founder of Hexer Factory. So I've been fortunately, working on the futuristic technologies for the last 8 years now. My main focus has always been AR, VR, and MR. So we call it as XR. So augmented reality, virtual reality, and mixed reality. And apart from that, we've also ventured into computer vision and a little bit on GIS as well. So here today, I'm going to be talking to you about mixed reality. Perfect. Thank you. So we just had a technical glitch. Sorry, I couldn't change the slide. So this is just a little bit about what we do. So we work on a motto that what the mind can conceive, it can achieve. So since we are always working on the futuristic technology, we always think, look at the possibilities. It's always hard to venture into something which you believe is very hard to achieve. But then what we do is we always make sure that we have an idea in mind, and we always believe that idea is bulletproof, so we catch on and keep moving forward. So about us, what we do is we basically try to bridge the gap between the digital world and the physical world. So that's where the technology comes itself from, the augmented reality, virtual reality, and mixed reality. So it's basically a bridge between the physical world and the digital world. So that's what we do. So we work across the globe with multiple clients, and we have a lot of Fortune 500 companies who we work, we've served, we've created multiple POCs for them. and of course, more than 100 plus projects. Yeah. Thank you. So mixed reality. I want to ask a question. How many of you actually know about mixed reality? Anybody who actually have, experienced this or heard about it? Now, yeah. So in that case, I just have to get on to a little bit of basics to get to this point. Now, so I have to talk a little bit on AR and VR to make you guys understand about mixed reality. So augmented reality. So how many of you actually know what is augmented reality? Now, yes. So a lot of people have actually used it. And today we have applications, mobile applications where we use augmented reality. There's, for example, Snapchat, where you open up your camera and then through your phone's display, you see your own face, and you can apply filters onto your face, right? So what happens here is that you have a display, you have a camera, and then through you're seeing through the camera, you're seeing the real world through your display. And then on your display, a computer generated CG element is added onto your face. So as simple as that. Now this can be applied in multiple use cases. So this is augmented reality. When you're talking about virtual reality, what happens in virtual reality? Like you have a head-mounted device, something which is similar to this. Sharath? So once you wear this device, you're completely immersed into a 3D world. I cannot see any one of you, but I can see a 3D world inside. Now, you have controllers like these to move around inside your 3D space. So what I do is I wear a HMD. It's called head-mounted device. And once I wear that device, I'm completely immersed and into a 3D world. So using these controllers, I can walk around, I can pick up things, I can fire a gun, or I can throw something. So, I can actually be in a 3D space and I can still walk around, move, and do a lot of stuff. Now, there are multiple use cases here as well. For example, training. We can have a immersive training. For example, let's say a fire safety training. You can train people what to do in case a fire exists. You have to follow a certain protocol and move up building, and that can be done because the use case which I'm talking right now is technically not possible in the real world because you cannot create a fire and ask people to leave. So you can create a 3D world where a fire can be created, nobody is hurt, and you can still, explain and make them understand the situation and follow the protocols. Now, what happens in virtual reality is the retention rate is extremely high. So when you see something and learn, or when you're being in a situation and learning, makes a lot of difference. So virtual reality it is. Now, you have mixed reality is a combination of both AR and VR. Now, what happens is we have a similar kind of setup here. So I'm going to show you another device where this is called HoloLens. It's a Microsoft product. So I can wear it. There's a transparent display here, right in front of my eyes. So I can see the real world, correct? And my hands are free to make gestures. So you understood, right? So in AR, you are interacting through your phone's display. Even though there's a CG element there, augmented into the physical world, still you interact through the phone's input. Here, your hands, using your hands, you can create gestures. So that becomes, that opens up a lot of possibilities, correct? I'm going to show you a small clip where you can actually get a glimpse about what the device is about. So how exciting was it? Now this is future. So we are in the future, and this is a possibility now. Until few years back, it was just perceived as something which is possible in the future, but the future is right now and it is possible. And we have created multiple applications. We've created multiple use cases. I just need a help with this. Yeah, I'm sorry, there's smaller technical glitch. No, the next one. I need to move to the next slide. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So here comes interactive data visualization. So like I said, mixed reality as such is that you see augmented information through your glasses. There's a display, head-mounted display, which has a small projector in it. It projects information, which looks like there are 3D holograms right in front of you. So now using your hand gestures, you can interact with the data. Now, this data can range between across multiple platforms, like multiple industries. Say, let's say that today's world is completely about data. There's so much of data, so you need to collect data, process it, and then use it according to your need. Now, when it comes to visualization, with billions of data, how do you visualize? Just looking at on a flat 2D screen gives you information. Of course, it does help you take informed decisions. But what if you're able to interact with that data? What if you're able to move around with that data right in front of your eyes? Now that opens up possibilities, because when you want to see an information in a 2D plane, when you have overlays on top of it, it becomes too difficult for you to visualize. But when the same information is in 3D, and then you have overlays on top of it, now that opens up your mind, and it enables you to take a lot of informed decisions. Now that's what this technology does. It helps you to visualize data and interact with it. Now, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the possibilities using mixed reality. Now, like I previously said, it allows you to, it allows us to blend the physical and digital world, correct? So it opens up real-time data, opens up avenues to real-time data visualization. And like I said, I can pull in information in real time and project it right in front of your eyes. So it helps us to take more informed decision. The second point is immersive training. Like I already explained, the retention rate here is extremely high. So you can, using guided work instruction, you can enable users. Say, when I say guided work instruction, I wear this helmet and then I have a task to make. For example, let me say that I'm wearing this helmet and I have to pick up this bottle. So when I move here, my camera detects using computer vision that this is a bottle, and it points me saying that I can pick up this bottle. So let's say that in terms of fixing a screw, on an automated, on an assembly line in an automobile industry. Let's say that you have multiple people working on the assembly line, and one particular person has to fix a door and screw up multiple things there. Now, what if he's able to visualize what he has to do? Correct? So we can calculate his time. We can imagine this glass as a third eye. Now, apart from the speed that he's working, he's also guided to do a particular task through visuals as well as audio. And then we can also calculate the time that he's taking to do the job. We can analyze if he's done the job right or wrong. And also, we can assist him, saying that he needs to do the job in a certain way. This opens up a lot of possibilities again. And also collaborative workspaces. So there's a lot of new technology that has come up today, where you can have meetings. Let's say that when I'm wearing a HoloLens, I can have my own avatar projected on my screen, right? My own avatar as well as the one who I'm connected with. So we can have collaborative workspaces. So we can have avatar talk for you, like, with your voice on, like we can have avatars talk. So it makes a much more collaborative workspace. And the last point, of course, there are a lot of X number of factors which makes this technology, it improves the productivity. So these are some of the hardware that is available in the market today. So we have Magic Leap, we have HoloLens, RealWear. RealWear is more of an industrial HMD. And we have a new company, Meta, which has come up with a brilliant product. We have Nreal, we have ODG and OX. So these are the products which is available in the market today, but there are a lot of other companies which is coming up with new products as well. So I thought, just to get into the technology is going to make it extremely hard for people to understand. So I thought that I'll take a use case scenario so that it'll be easier for you to understand what this technology does. So this is a project which I worked in 2018-19, I guess. So what we did is we did a POC for a Middle East client. What we did here is that the client had issues with people doing an energy audit. So they wanted some, assistance from us, coming up with a solution for them where they can streamline the process. So we use this hardware called Darkry. So Darkry is a smart helmet. So what we did is we came up with 4 features to make their life easier. So we used data visualization, we got guided work instruction, and we had thermal imaging there, and we also used remote monitoring. These are the 4 main features of the application. I'm going to play a small video where you'll understand what the project is about. Then I'll go on in detail explaining about the project.
To achieve the Dubai Plan 2021 launched by His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, Vice President and Prime Minister of the UAE and the ruler of Dubai, to make the Emirates a smart and sustainable city. Dubai Electricity and Water Authority, DEWA, is always embracing new technologies to enable better services. To achieve this, DEWA has now adopted the Darkry Industrial Augmented Reality Helmet. This is one of the most advanced augmented reality helmets available today. It enables access to real-time data, which gives situational awareness to workers, making their work easier and faster, by providing a range of unique tools to create a much safer working environment. With the Darkry AR helmet, DEWA's technical workforce can use real-time augmented instructions and support to minimize errors and make more efficient use of their time and effort. By constantly upgrading itself and adopting to new technologies like Darkry AR helmet, DEWA is playing a pivotal role in bringing the vision of Dubai's future to life. Dubai Electricity and Water Authority for generations to come.
So this is a project which we did back in 2018. So how many of you actually understood? Were you able to connect? Yeah, right. So what we did is, I'm just gonna quickly show you the architecture that we used. What we did here is that, if you notice, there's a substation to the bottom left. So the substation is what you saw there. Technically, what we did is that when you do an energy audit, what happens is that you see a physical reading on a substation. Like you want to look into the old meter or ammeter or how much current is there, things like that. Now, when you do an energy audit, you have a piece of paper, you write information on top of that, taking a note of all the readings. Now, what we thought is what if we can pull the information, because the substation is connected to a SCADA system, which is in turn connected to a SAP, integrated with SAP. So the data is processed, so we can pull the information in real time and project it in front of the person doing the energy audit. So what he could do is, he can see the physical reading, compare it with the past history. You always have a median value. So you know if the machine is functioning perfectly or not. If there is any kind of intervention that is required, he can quickly take action. So the second thing is that we spoke about thermal camera. That is, we had to think about preventive maintenance. So we thought that if we can have a thermal camera integrated, what we can do is, if usually in an electrical substation, there's overheating which happens. If something goes wrong, there's overheating. So if the overheating happens, then obviously, there's something more damage that can be caused to the device. But usually to a naked eye, it is not visible. But for using a thermal camera, you can understand the overheating. So we integrated a thermal camera so that, when you see something which is overheated, you can understand. And as a part of preventive maintenance, you can have that particular part changed or particular issue fixed. So that is second thing. Talking about this architecture, so here, if you notice that the SCADA system, from the SCADA, SAP is there, and then through a central server, what happens is, we pull the information and then display it directly on our HoloLens, the Darkly device, smart helmet. Now here we've created a separate application for our own. So using the same thing which I explained previously, we use the thermal camera, we use remote monitoring and smart grid application. So I'll be talking in detail about these things. One second. Yeah. I think I've already covered the guided work instruction. So thermal imaging, yes. So I've covered that as well. So here what we do is we understand that it's hard for naked eyes to capture certain things. So we use thermal imaging to understand about overheating, and then we as a part of preventive maintenance, we make sure that that particular device is changed. Now this increases the lifespan of the assets. When you change things on time, obviously, the lifespan of the particular thing is there, and also it improves the efficiency of that particular device if it is changed on time, correct? So this helps. The second thing is that remote monitoring. Now, remote monitoring is a new concept. It is very hot today. What happens here is that you have, let's say that Toyota as such, you have your own car, and then the car is parked somewhere in, they're driving from Chennai to Bangalore, and midway the car is damaged due to some stopped due to some technical error. You don't have to necessarily send your best expertise all the way up to them. Imagine you have a dealership there or a service center there locally, and then that particular person can reach the car in say 15 minutes. And now that person might not have the expertise, all that expertise that is required, but still there can be another person sitting in this office and guiding him how to do the job using annotations. Let's say that he'll be wearing a glass, and this particular the person who's sitting in this office can see what that person is looking at. Technically, he'll be wearing the helmet, and the camera on the helmet will be detecting what is happening inside the car. So now this person sitting in this office can point out on a particular thing and ask him to check it. Let's say that he who wants to check the oil or see if the battery is working, he can point and tell them that if this is working fine or this is not working fine. And based on that, he can, there are certain things like which can be solved there itself. And then in certain cases, the car has to be brought back to the service station. This is what we call it as remote monitoring. This is an extremely effective tool, and a lot of people are actually moving to this technology today. Now, as a part of mixed reality pipeline, what we do is we use 3D asset creation softwares, because technically whatever you're seeing, everything is 3D, right? So we use Maya, Autodesk, or Blender to create 3D content. And then once the 3D content is there, it is imported into our Unity project. So Unity is a gaming engine. So most of our applications are built using gaming engines. One is Unity, another one is called Unreal. So we work on both Unity as well as Unreal. And then we compile the project file, and then we bring it into Visual Studio, and then again compile it, creating a mixed reality application here. So this is what we do. Any questions? I think I'm done with the explanation now. If you have any other questions, then I'll be happy to handle. Yeah, please.
How do you actually instruct your program to say, okay, here is where the issue is, and because the position of the user could be anywhere. He could be looking at it from the left or right or from a far distance. And how are you creating that spatial recognition at that point?
Okay, so the device has inbuilt spatial recognition. Like, once you start a HoloLens, what happens is that it detects your environment. Once you start wearing the HoloLens, the first thing it does is it detects the entire environment. It scans and understands what is what. So once the whole thing is scanned, the next thing is that I know where my locations are, right? So I know where my space. So the surface detection is also done. The spatial detection is also done. So now it becomes easier for me to point on any 3D space. So you use 3D annotations. So we can, let's say that I can use a marker, just like the way you can adjust in the real world, you can also adjust it in the 3D world. So it creates depth. There is a depth here, right? So the physical thing which moves from here to here, just like the way it moves in 3D space also. Technically, what happens is it is bigger when it is closer to me, and the size becomes smaller when it has to come. So it creates a depth. And then I can point it right at you. So I can move it forward and backward. Yeah, it will be calculated dynamically.
Oh, very sorry. So it fixes on a point, and then the distance is recalculated by the relative portion of the object that is observed. Is that correct?
Absolutely correct. Thank you. I also have a small demo that, but I think I won't be able to stream it on the video wall, but I can always show it to you guys. Will that be okay? Perfect.
There should be an advantage being in person as well.
So for those attending, can you guys hear me? Is this on? Yeah, for those who are remote, Sharath here is showing a demo on his PC. Sorry, you will not be able to probably see it.
You can actually show Sharath. Live for you?
Virtual reality only works when you're not virtual.
You can actually have it here.
We can maybe project that the camera.
I think they're seeing
I
it,
hope you can see a little bit, right?
but they won't be able to see it.
No, they won't be able to.
I'm sorry, it was a last minute decision. I thought, I should give a physical demo so that you understand what the technology is about.
Okay. Raja is coming up with a quick webcam solution. Hold on one second.
They can see actually. Anita, can you see there?
Yes, I'm able to see yours, Edu.
Yeah, you're probably able to see the screen that Raja is projecting. Maybe you can explain the demo a little bit.
Yeah, sure, I'll do that. So this is a project which we again did for a Middle East client where this was an energy plant. So we had the energy plant as a miniature model, and on top of the model we used HoloLens to give them information regarding the factory itself. So here, as you can see, there is a lot of data here. Now, as Sharath is pointing onto it, he can use his gestures and get to know more information regarding that particular thing. Here, in this case, he's opening up a turbine, a steam turbine, and also, you can literally see how the turbine is functioning. Can you open up another one? Yeah. So you can control this device using multiple gestures. For example, you can use bloom or air tap, or you can use your head rotation for gestures. So that's how you control this device. So he's opened up another option where, yeah, I'm sorry. So what happens is here is that since the content is on a 3D space, when I actually walked across him, there's the tracking suddenly goes off, rightly to your question, right? So you can actually see it overlaid on top of me. Well, that's what it happens. So you saw that? Correct.
So in the demo you showed, right, with the where there is a factory and say somebody is looking at the electrical panel, the device is able to recognize that it's an electric panel, right?
Correct.
That recognition, does it happen on the device itself, or like it needs to be connected to the cloud, or how does it work? Because it probably cannot detect every object in the world. Right?
Correct.
Like you need to say, okay, this is what you want to detect.
So back then, we used a technology like, there's something called markers. So you can have a marker. It can be just like very similar to what happens in a QR code. So we had the marker, and the marker was assigned to this particular system. So as soon as you detect this marker, it will know that this is the system. So what we do is we overlay, we had a similar kind of substation model overlaid onto the physical model in real scale.
So it's up to the person wearing it to align it to the actual physical object, so they can like do certain things, or
not exactly. Well, in this case, what happens is that you can also have that as an option. If it is not aligned properly, then you can move it and align it onto to exactly overlay on top of the device. But in most cases, it gets aligned itself because it is made in such a way the marker is positioned And then according to the marker, the real scale model is also popped up. So it will exactly overlay on top of
These
the
visual markers are like similar to QR code, is it? Or
very similar to QR code. And it can be cloud-based as well.
We'll take some questions from
Yeah, sure.
persons who are online as well. Maybe we'll take some of the questions here and then we'll also specify anybody wants
Okay,
to ask.
I'll take up the question of Kiran Raj. How long a person can wear this device? Are there any side effects wearing it? Okay, so there are different kinds of device. Actually, in the current scenario, to be very honest with you, there are some devices which has overheating issues. And in most cases, you can wear the device as long as the battery lasts. So to charge a device, it will take next amount of time. For example, in the case of HoloLens, it takes across 2 hours. So technically, you need to have a break in between of 2 hours to start using it again, unless you have a spare one to continue using. But in terms of effects, I don't think so. Any effects, we haven't faced any kind of effects, and we've not heard about one as well. But there are few devices which has overheating issues. But this is again an evolution. So people are constantly working on it, and then they're coming up with different kind of solutions. Second question is application which you showed is built in which one? Is that HoloLens 1, 2? No, the application, there are two kind of applications. The demo which we showed is built for HoloLens, and the project which we showed you, the energy audit, that was built in Darkly, using Darkly Smart Helmet.
Maybe, Anita, we can also open up if somebody want to ask a question.
So you have this motion sickness in VR, right? Generally,
Correct.
so if you wear for a long time, you feel sick.
Correct.
Because of your. So is the same problem prevails in mixed reality helmets as well?
No, I think the reason why mixed reality came up itself is because of the problem statement which you just addressed. The thing is that the motion sickness happens in VR because technically you are completely immersed in a VR space. Now, in most cases, the motion sickness happens only when the application is not built right. Of course, you need to follow certain protocols while building this kind of application. What happens is that your mind works in a certain way, and when things which is something which is unreal, which is not usually perceived by your brain, that's when you start feeling motion sickness. For example, you're standing in a location, and then let's say that most of the application developers, what they do is that using the hand gestures, you can move. Now, if you move, your body is static. And then in the 3D space, you're actually moving. So what happens? Your brains get confused. Right? Physically, your body is standing in one space, yet you're moving. Now, that collapses. Now, this is not, so they came up with a solution where you can actually hover. You can use a point. So from here, I can move to point B or any space here. Literally, I can just move around. That makes it easier. That was a solution which the VR industry came up with. Any other questions?
Was connected online, have any questions? If you have to check the participants.
One question while we are waiting for them is the Google Glass came, right? A few
Correct.
years ago, and it was dead because of a lot of reasons, right? But now what I understand is they're repurposing it for like industrial uses. So there is like a non-consumer version. What devices you see becoming like widespread in like near future, like, or being more popular?
So Google Lens,
Google Glass.
yeah, the Google Glass, correct. So technically it was named as Google Lens. So it was way ahead in time. So they came up with an innovation where people couldn't actually use it and create applications. That was the biggest pain point back then. So people had to get used to it to actually understand the technology and create a use case for it. So they scrapped it because of, also there's another issue where when it was released, a lot of, they didn't actually think about too many security issues because of that. So they didn't have any kind of protocols to be followed. So people could use it for X number of factors. For example, we did a project for one of the police departments where you can wear these glasses. Technically, I can do facial detection in real time. So we used HoloLens. So, you know, we had a small database where I can pick up a face and say if this particular face has any criminal records or not, if or he's a normal sane. Now, here, they didn't have any kind of protocols back then. So that's one huge problems which they faced. Now, I think the technology has evolved a lot. To answer precisely to your question, HoloLens is one of the best products available in the market today, and HoloLens 2, the one which we use for demo today is HoloLens 1. HoloLens 2 is a very exciting device. It has come up with a lot of new features, and it has opened up a lot of possibilities as well. So some of the collaborative applications that I've spoken to you about is possible in HoloLens 2. And apart from that, especially for industrial use case, I think RealWear is a better device because it comes with all the industrial protocols that is required to be maintained. Yeah. Sure. No problem.
Using the APIs that are exposed by HoloLens for developing any such, especially considering the stream of data transfer.
Now, you're talking about just using the APIs given by the HoloLens alone, or you're talking about integrating it with? No, see, that's what I said. I showed you the pipeline, right? So what we do is we use a game engine to, because it requires any kind of 3D information that you're seeing, it needs to be created. So it is created in third-party applications like Maya, Max, Blender. And then it is brought into the gaming engine, like Unity, Unreal. And from there, it is compiled and taken into Visual Studio. And then from Visual Studio, it is built as Apex into it is installed into the device.
So for anything that can be visualized as a 3D object should have to follow this process. Also,
yes.
What about dynamic stuff? Like I'm changing my position and I want to see a new object. So how does it work? Like creating on the book?
You're asking like you're talking about scanning the world, or?
Okay, so let's say the HoloLens, the HoloLens 2 video that you played. And then there was this lady who was just moving the moon here and there and the rock here and there. So are these already created to be presented, or is there any so related to the gesture of this person it's happening? So
okay. So in that particular use case, what happens is they've used HoloLens for designing purpose. Now, she's an architect or a designer who's standing in the middle of a theater. Now, she's already created a design for that, theater. Now, what happens? There are multiple 3D elements involved there. Now, what can happen is she can pick up and she can move it around and see which is best suited. It enables her to come up with her own creativity, because you'll already have a list of assets as library, correct? So you can have different kind of trees, you can have different kind of gadgets according to industry. In her case, architecture, so she might have a lot of different props. So those props can be moved across and played around, using your gestures, and see which suits the best for you.
These are all already created and they're in a library.
Absolutely, yes. So any kind of 3D thing that you're interacting with is already being created, and it is inside the application as a library. So you can just pick it up and place it however you want it. So you can start interacting with it. So and also you can program it in such a way that how your interaction should be. For example, let's say that there is a car standing in front of you, like a 3D car. You press a button, a door opens up, or your bonnet opens up. So this can be created as interactivity. As you click on this door, then the door opens. So it is programmed accordingly. So two things. One is that 3D content, and then how you interact with the 3D content. So this is done through programming. Thank you. Sure. Please.
So I could see that the helmets are quite bulky to be much functional in terms of any rugged environments, right? So for that, do you see a trend where the like, is there any company, or like, do you see a trend which is going to be in probably a couple of years where the devices are becoming more and more functional, maybe like a strap on or something like that?
No, unfortunately, the one which I showed you today, there is a strap actually which comes along with this device, but then it is broken. So that's the reason why he's holding it in his hand. Otherwise, it's usually you have a head mount where you can adjust it and fit it according to your need.
But
It
then
fits you perfectly.
that's still quite bulky.
Yes, they're refining it. So just like how the mobile phones have evolved over a period of years from using keypads and now all the way up to touchscreen and with micro slim phones having, I just recently saw a phone with 16 GB RAM. So the technology is evolving, and there are a lot of companies which has come up now trying to solve the problems that has been faced by the industry, and billions have been invested in this technology to come up with a lot of new features. So now there are two things here. One is that this particular device is built on Windows platform, and then other devices which I showed you initially, like for example Meta or Nreal, which is Android based. Most cases they have their own OS, customized OS, but based on Android platform. Now those are the kind of devices which are less bulkier. Now it comes with a devices like HoloLens comes with a price tag because it has more processing power. So a lot of more processing that you can do with the 3D stuff, right? So when you go into Android based and obviously devices which is there, then you have certain limitations. But the possibility is endless in both things. But then you have certain limitations here and there.
That brings me to another question, because that's where I kind of based upon it. So now that we have an amalgamation of AI and also the MR and stuff, so how do you, as a founder, how do you see the trend moving towards using AI with MR or both?
I'm projecting a 100% growth in the next 5 years.
The edge processing, and I mean, I'm asking from the hardware perspective.
Yeah. So with see, previously it was like data from somewhere. It was actually you required an X amount of time and also processing associated with it, right? And also hardware and infrastructure. Now with 5G coming up, which obviously uses edge computing, and a lot of processing happening relatively very closely to you. I see a huge possibility from that, because until I read about or learned about what 5G can do, I thought it's going to take some time, but then after knowing it, it is around the corner. Definitely, it's going to be around the corner.
Thanks, Praveen. In the interest of time, being fair to the virtual participants also, we'll have his last question and then.
Yeah, sure. Is it possible to create a model with real-time object on time and save it so it can be used in a later time? Right now, you can make modifications to the model, yes, in a certain way, But then there are possibilities too. For example, Unity has come up with an application called Pixies. So where you can import a model, a CAD model in real time. For example, you have a CAD model of a car, you can import it. Previously, it was extremely difficult to import a model in real time. Now there is a possibility to do it. But if you want to make modifications to an existing model, yes, you can do it. But it comes with certain difficulties.
Thanks, Praveen. Hope
Thank you so
I
much.
answered your question, and I'm sure you will be more than happy to answer more questions that you will
Definitely,
give
next
your contacts and everything out there.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for inviting me here. It was a
Thanks,
pleasure
Praveen.
to
That
speak
was a
here.
wonderful
Thank you.
session. Definitely, I went into the mixed reality and hope everybody was there. Now,
Thank you.
coming back to reality and all the programming that needs to happen to get this also done, we'll have Raja, who's a lead engineer in Toyota Connected, talk about Rust basics, Rust catching up a lot, and hope we'll have a interesting session on that.
Am I audible?
Yes, Raja, you are.
So probably I'll quickly share my screen. Yeah. Okay, so hello everyone, I'm Raja. I'm working as a lead engineer in Toyota Connected, and I have a wide experience. Like I worked in broadcasting industry, digital cinema industry, and now exploring the possibility in automobile industry through Toyota Connected. And okay, let's quickly jump to the topic. Like I'm going to present about the Rust basics. So, okay, so what are all the things which I'm going to cover in this topic? So what is Rust and why Rust when compared to the other languages, and how to build basically how what is the first step, how to create a project and all that. So simple example with some simple examples, and if you, keywords which are in Rust and collections. The main thing is ownership. The ownership is one of the unique concept in Rust, which we might be interested to know about it, and also the struct enum and how it is different from other languages and vector strings. So similarly, like also the error handling, how it is done, and also the triads. Triads is something like the inheritance concepts in other languages. So probably we'll explore on that. And also the validating references with lifetime. This is one of the trickier title, might be a little confusing as well. So probably we'll touch upon the basics on that. And the fearless concurrency is the final one, which is an important one. So probably you can follow through my the mouse pointer, so that if there is too much information in the slides, it will be helpful to track the session. So what is Rust? So if you see, Rust makes you write code faster, and when you actually know about the basics and everything, you can actually code faster, and it's more reliable and safe code, because the compiler takes care of everything, and you can write more reliable, and you can concentrate on the logic mainly, and you can also have control over the low level control with these, gives a better performance and safe concurrency. So this is one of the main feature in Rust. Memory safety and memory management and all that is an additional thing. So here is a comparison chart between different languages, like why Rust. So this is my
preference. Like there is a learning curve. If you see for Golang, if you see if you just learn for a couple of days or something, you can start working on it. So that's why it's easy to adopt. And for Rust, right, there is a steep learning curve. And if you are familiar with all the concepts, right, it will make you more interesting. And for C++, as you all know, it's a harder learning curve. When to use. I see like Golang is mainly designed to handle server-side application, but it can also do other stuffs as well. But mainly it is more apt for server-side applications. And if you see Rust, right, it can also do server-side application and also do more memory efficient and performant code. And also when there is need for performance and all, right, you can use that. So similarly for C++. And if you consider the review time for the code which has been raised, right? Golang, I would say medium, because if you have to go through the logics and everything, and if there is any runtime error possibilities and all that, right? So probably have to review it a little bit more. And for Rust, right, the compiler takes care of all the runtime errors which can expect to happen and all that. And similarly for C++, it's the review time is really high. You have to understand more. So, and regarding the concurrency, and it's easy to implement in Golang, right? It's very easy. Just you use a Go, and with the proper channels and everything, you can easily implement concurrency. But consider that if you have missed some logging in the right place or something, you will be breaking your head to see where exactly that error happened and all that. So in that case, in that sense, right, there is a maintenance cost. So, but in Rust, right, you don't need to worry about all that. So whatever you pass to the variable, it can actually detect you in runtime failures, and if there is any null values and everything, it can easily detect all that information. And for writing it in C++, right, you need expert knowledge to write in a concurrent code. And for dev time, right, dev time is much lesser. You can just write on a fly for Golang, and for Rust, it's medium. You have to understand the concept and all that. And you should be aware of what exactly you're doing, whether I have to pass it as a reference or should I give a mutable functionality and all that. So it will make you think when you write each and every line of code, right, it will make you think what exactly you want to do. And for code maintenance and all, I would say Golang is medium. Why? Because of the maintenance cost, which I explained. If if there is the bugs, right, bugs can happen in Golang, but when you see in Rust, right, considerably less amount of bugs will happen, because most of the things are done by the compiler. Compiler will detect most of the issues, runtime issues and everything, and it will make you write a better safe code. And for bugs, I would say that it's medium complex to debug because of those things which I have explained. And here the most bugs are solved at the compile time itself. And dev experience, it's controversial, like easy to implement and boring, because there are limited set of functionalities and everything in Golang, which is like making the user write the same thing again, and they might get bored. So that's what I understand from the internet. And for us, right, it is like it's medium complex, and it makes us focus on only on the programming logic. Like when there is a task that you have to, it will make you really focus on the programming logic, because each and every line which you write, it will make you think whether what I have to do exactly. Otherwise, if you just keep give access to all the mutable variables, right, it might lead into a issue in the runtime. So now let's quickly go see how you can compile code in Rust and everything. So this is a basic thing, say a simple example to compile, like using the Rust C compilers, and the Rust code is has extension .rs. And to create a new project, you will use cargo new data, the project name, and the To compile and build, cargo build, and to compile, build and run, you have to do called cargo run, and to compile, cargo check. So cargo check is some of the it's an important functionality if you see, because this is what will be using it frequently. Because you don't want to create a binary every time, right? So you just need to see if the code compiles or not. So this so that's why it is important. And so about the crates.io, that's like there are open source contributors who actually contribute to the crates.io project, which we can actually pull down to our project and link it. So quickly we'll show see a demo. So I'm creating new project, and if you see what all the files got generated initially. So if you see cargo, there's a package information, who created it and for who is the author and all that. And if you see the dependency column, right, where you can actually add all the external dependencies, the format in which you can add is like probably one of the external dependency like rand is there, where you can say rand is equal to the sender version, like within the codes, like 0.0.5 or something, whatever the version you want. So if you just include it, and then if you run cargo.build, it will automatically pull all the dependencies which you want and all that. So probably we'll quickly build it, and probably we will see what all other files, other files. So here is the main function. So here it got generated. So if you see, after we built, we got a cargo log, which actually logs the dependency and its version, everything into this particular log file. And also the target file is where you will get all the binaries. By default, it's debug. If you want to create a release version, you have to explicitly mention that. So here is our service. So probably can directly run this as well. Okay. So we'll quickly go to the next one. So let's, what all the keywords and the collections. So if you see, to create a variable, right, we will use let. So let x is equal to 25. This creates a floating point, and here, if you want to explicitly mention that, because by default it is float 64, but if you want to explicitly create a float 32, you can explicitly mention the type here using a colon. And here is another interesting feature, like see how many times you would have seen that when there is a constant declared, right, 10,000 million or something, we would be counting the zeros. So for that, they have a feature like you can use underscore separator, so that it is more readable for integers. And for character types, it's 4 bytes, and it represents Unicode scalar. If the interesting thing is, like, you can also hold emojis, various different languages, Hindi, Kamal, and all that into this particular type. And tuple is represented by simple braces, and you can have a group. You can grouping. Tuple is mainly used to group together a variety of types, like different types can be grouped together, and you can access it by using a .0, .1, .2, like that. And arrays are represented by arrays are represented by square bracket. And if you see, you can also explicitly mention the type and the size of the array. The third one right here, if you see, if you want to have the same number repeated in the array, how many times and what is the number of times it has to repeat it. So these two are same. So 9 semicolon 4 will create an array of 4 in size, and which has a 9. And to create a function, right, you use a fn keyword, and if you see here, this is the way we return it using the arrow mark, and it's returning a tuple here, integer and bool. And also, if you notice, there is no semicolon here, which means it is returning that value. And if you see this here, right, underscore, this is something useful when you are in the process of development, so that later at the point you will be using this variable and finish the functionality. So until that point, you can use an underscore so that the compiler ignores it and doesn't give a warning or compile error. And for repetition, we can use loop, while, and for. Loop, if you are using loop, it's you have to use the break command so that it gets written. Whatever we have it after the break, right? It can get assigned to the variable which is assigned. And while is similar, and for loop also it's similar to other languages. So here it will print the reverse of that particular number continuously, 3, 2, 1. So quickly we'll go through a sample. So here, if you see the similar one, and if you a little bit like cover the mutable and immutable thing here. So here, if you see, this code will compile, and this is not possible because by default it is immutable, and when we try to mutate it, right, it will not allow. So there will be a compile error. And in this code, this also gives a warning. So why? Because if you are saying it's mutable, then why can't I change it? Because it gives a warning. Why? Because you are already assigning it here, and the next line you are again assigning it here. Why you are doing that? Like that, it will give a warning. So the compiler is so brilliant that it will give you each and every small mistakes which you do, all the dead codes and everything. It will be able to identify. So is there anything? Yeah. So now we will go to the ownership reference, and ownership is there's some rules for ownership. Like every value in Rust has a variable that's called its owner. So each and every variable will have its owner, one owner at a time. And then when the owner goes out of the scope, value will be dropped. So we'll see a simple code snippet in that. Like we are creating a string, and we are doing some stuff in the string. So when you're creating the string, the ownership goes to S. And when you can do some stuff with the string, and then when it goes out of scope, right? When after this, the string will get deleted. Probably will analyze more on how it is doing later. And references and borrows. In references, right? Like if you don't want to transfer the ownership, you can also give references. So here we are creating a string, and then we are giving a references to the particular calculate length method, and here we are calculating length and returning it. So here Ampersand represents the borrow functionality, and similarly for slice, you can get the range of slice from a string, and then as a reference to read and everything. So probably we'll quickly go to as example. So this explains about the ownership. Like say in this line, right? Yes, it has the ownership for this particular string, and when yes is passed here, it gives the ownership to the take ownership because it's not passed with ampersand. So it's the functionality of this particular take ownership function to actually free this the string. So when it goes out of the scope after doing some operation, it will call the drop method. You see, automatically it will call the drop method. Drop, it's not like a drop method; it's a drop try it actually. So drop try it will be has been implemented for all the default features in Go Rust. And see if you after it is freed, right? Yes is not accessible here. If you try to access yes, it will throw an error. So similarly, we will see a seed for integer. So here, yeah, x is 5, and it makes a copy only. If you see, if you pass the integer, right, it makes a copy, and it doesn't drop or anything at this point of time. It's just copies the value, and then after this point also, you can access this. What is the difference is that this is stored in stack, and this is stored in heap. All the heap objects, right? It will be the ownership plays a role on all the heap objects. So all the default data types like integer, float, and everything, the copy triad will be overwritten. So the copy triad is something. Triad is nothing but like a functionality which it does when you do an assignment operation. So just copies the value from this one to this actual thing. That's it. So. Yeah, take ownership. After take ownership, you cannot. After this take ownership method itself, you cannot refer. You cannot refer. You cannot refer. Probably I will quickly show an example. So if it will clearly give you an information like string does not implement the copy triad, and it is moved into the functionality. It's moved here already. It's moved here and takes ownership. So the value is borrowed after move. So it's not possible like that. It's thank you. So we'll quickly go through the second sample. Here it generates a string and then assign it, and then it's similar. So probably we can skip this as well. Yeah, we can skip this. Can quickly cover the other things. So here we'll talk about structs. Structs are nothing but package together multiple related objects in a group. So if you see, we are having a username, email, and sign in account and active all grouped together to form a user. And if you see the simple initialization, right? We are creating a user with we are initializing this particular object here. And if you make a note of it, the parameters which is passed to initialization and the field name, right? If it matches, what it does is you don't need to actually say email email and all that. So there is a simplicity which we can do that one. And also for tuple, right? There is a tuple struct where you can define the struct colors like colors, point, or even for IP address, right? We can have 4 parameters. We can define those structs like that. So quickly we'll go through a sample. So here we'll come to this one. So here we are creating a user. Probably instead of this user, you can imagine that it's a default or something. And here we are actually creating a user. So we know this value is going to change. For the remaining values which doesn't change, right, you can use the default here by using dot default, so that all the remaining values get assigned automatically. This is one functionality. And about this one, right? The derived trait. So here struct is our custom own object. We are not really sure how to print it and how, when you are actually trying to print the value inside the struct or something. So in that case, we need to derive this debug triad so that it will be able to print what this particular object holds. So that's why we have added this debug triad here, the derived debug and everything. It's an inbuilt functionality, inbuilt macro, which is already available. Otherwise, we have to explicitly call implement the debug triad here. And we'll also go through another example where we will implement the functions. So if you see, there's a rectangle object, and we are actually trying to create new functions inside rectangle. And you are calculating area of the rectangle and then return it. If you notice here, we are actually passing the reference. So whenever this particular area is called, right, it is called as a reference here. So like borrowing the particular value. It's not actually transferring the value. And okay, so this is one thing. So about the enums, enums has a special functionality in Rust. So if you see, this is a default enum which can be created, and here you can also bind more data in enums. If you see, we can also add the IP address params here bind it, and also for v6 we can add it as a string, so that is also possible. And the most commonly used enum, right? Enum is the option enum. We'll go through it with an example. So here, what we are trying to do is we are creating a sum phi, assigning to phi. If you see here, option the enum option has sum as well as none. So, so this particular +1 is taking an option. So obviously it will take the parameter phi. And when we get this parameter phi, there is a match that happens. And if you see, sum of phi will be assigned here, and the respective implementation will get called. So sum of phi +1 is 6 will get returned. And then also similarly, if you access none, it will just return none. So if you quickly run it, you can see that output. So we'll also go to the other example. So here in United States, right, like there is a in a certain period of time they have binded the quarter coin with a specific specific state in the US. So we can also do that mapping here by linking the field of a enum with another enum. Like we can just bind an enum inside an enum. Just to provide that functionality, I have added this. So that is also possible. So if you see, all the other functionalities are same. It just keep matching the value and then prints it and executes it. And this is also possible. If you see, you can have multiple line implementation. And vectors and strings. So vectors is single data structure stored value next to each other. So if you see, vectors and strings are allocated in heap. And if you see here, we can access the vector elements directly at using the index, which will actually return that particular value. With the, if you see here, we are getting it as references, that is your borrow. And there is another way to access it, like get of 2, which actually returns the option enum. So this will help us to assign it, saying that if this to find out if the particular element is there or not. If there is no element, we can probably put some meaningful message or handle it accordingly. So it will be a useful feature. You can also iterate through the vectors here, like in other languages. And so if you see strings, right, there are two types of strings which the owned strings and then the borrowed strings. So this you can commonly see in all the Rust code. And here we are using the owned strings here. If you see, S1 is owned string, S2 is owned string. And see, if you are trying to concatenate it, we are using an ampersand here. So why we need to use an ampersand is like the implementation of that add it right inside the string, right? It takes the self value, that is S1. And it takes the address of strings. So here we cannot directly pass the string and lose the ownership of S2. So here we are passing it as a reference to read it and add the value, and then return a new string with new ownership. So here S1 ownership is lost, and it is assigned to the S3. So about characters which can be represented, it is UTF-8 in strings, and it occupies 2 bytes each. And the characters like this, right, each will be 2 bytes. So this is not allowed, like ampersand hello of 0, it's not a valid character, right? It just represents 1 byte. And but you can do this, get a range of character in a valid range. This is not valid because it's invalid character boundary. So if you do this, it will do a runtime error. Instead of a compile time error, because it's not able to recognize whether you have done a proper thing or not. So, and similarly, if you want to print character, get character wise, you can do char, and if you want to get byte wise, you can do byte. And for error handling, there is another enum type which is a result of the E represent error, and this is the actual result which is returned. So it handles. So there is also a panic macro which you can use it. So in this case, right, when the hello text is not there, you can also use .unwrap to panic the call, or you can use expected if you want to do a custom message. If you want to add a custom message, you can do that. And here is a simple example of when the file is not we are checking the result enum, and we are checking if it is there, we'll return the handle, else we will be checking one more match enum implementation, seeing that if the file is not found, if the error kind is file is not found, we'll try to create the file again, and if it is fine, then we'll return the file handle, else we'll be panicking. And here this code panics because it's not able to access because it's not a valid index. And there's one more functionality, like if you see in this method, it's a run method, and then we are returning result enum, right? And if you just append this question mark towards the end, right? If there is any failure during the read operation, right, it will automatically return this error. So you don't need to explicitly add if this particular result is successful and then return this, return that, and all that is not needed. So trait is similar to inheritance. Like there are some rules which trait follows, like orphan rules, which is called one of so one of your traits on another type, and another traits on your type, and but not a foreign trait on foreign type. So we'll go one by one. So one of your trait is like we have our own trait. So if you see here, we have implemented one. We have added one trait. This particular trait can on anyone's type. Like see, there is a struct here. You can use. We can implement this particular summary for this particular news article, or you can implement this particular summary for tweet. So based on user, whether if you want to tweet or if you want to summarize for the news article, he can call accordingly, and the respective thing will get called. So that is the functionality of this particular one. So this is for the first one. For second one, right, there are many traits like debug, display, and all that, which can be overridden for our own trait, like for news article and everything, so that we can customize that particular implementation, and we can add our own functionality. And we'll quickly go through. And about the foreign trait on foreign thing, right? Say, for example, there is a trait for integer and there is a trait for the file, right? Then if you are trying to override that functionality, implement that functionality, right? Then when we use that in our code, right, it will conflict with, it might conflict with other, each other. So they're not allowing that. So this is the thing. I don't think there's anything special, whatever I explained. So probably we'll skip this. So validating references with lifetime. This is one of the important thing and little confusing as well. So probably we'll go through it little slowly. Like first rule applies to input lifetime. So each input parameter gets its own lifetime. This is the first rule. And second rule is for the output lifetime. So if you see, for example, here this particular function doesn't need to explicitly mark the lifetime of the particular call. Say like this, like the apostrophe A, and then in each and every after the ampersand and all that. So these are references, right? So these are borrow values. So these annotation need to be added because we are just saying that the annotation is valid for the whole lifetime of the function. So if you apply these rules here, what it will do is the compiler itself will change it for only one parameter, right? It will, for the first parameter, it can for each and every parameter, input parameter, it will put a /a here, and when you apply the second rule, it will try to apply the whatever. If there is only one parameter, it will just set the same lifetime to the output parameter. So after applying the second rule, if you see here, right, all the references, which is having the ampersand value, right, it has the lifetime. So so we don't need to explicitly annotate in this case. So if you see, directly using this first word will work. But in this case, right, in this particular function, if you see, there are two functions, and we don't know whether after passing the y value, right, immediately if he has dropped that value or something, if he has written some code, something like that, what will happen? So the function in the implementation inside longest will not work, right? So for that, when it applies the first rule, right, what it will do, each and everything will have its own lifetime. So first one will have A, second will have B, and when you apply the second rule, right, it doesn't know which lifetime to put for the second one, so it will fail. So that's why we need to explicitly mention the lifetime for this case alone. So probably we'll quickly go through an example to understand it better. So here, if you see, we have a string. The string is valid till the end of main function. And if there is a sub block where string 2 is valid, the string 2 is valid inside that block alone. So when you call longest for string 1 and string 2, if you see the resultant value, we are mentioning here, see, all the parameters will have the same lifetime. That's what we are saying. So even if string 2 has the lifetime within the scope, the return type will also have the lifetime within the scope. If you see here, result will have inside within the scope, and this code works. So we'll slightly modify this, probably like result. And then you don't need to print here. We'll print here. So what will happen when you do this? So here, what happened is, like, string 2 doesn't live long enough. It's clearly saying that string 2 is not living long enough, because the longest function can return anything, right? It can also return string 2, or it can also return a string 1, anything it can return. So if you are not sending the least lifetime, then it's a problem. So that's why it's clearly saying that it's not possible. So that's so this is what I explained here. Lifetime of the reference returned will be the smallest of the references passed in the function, and all references inside the function should have the same lifetime. This is one thing. So I hope you have understood. So probably we'll go through another example. So this is the first one. Here you don't need to explicitly mention, because when you apply these rules and all, the compiler itself will be able to do it. So actually the compiler development team is actually working on it to make it more easier. So probably the next compiler version also might not need this explicit mention of this particular lifetime. If in this case, right, if you remove this, there will be an error. It doesn't know which one to choose. Like that, we'll get an error. So is there anything specific here? Okay, probably we'll skip that. That's, so hope you're clear about the validating reference. Now coming to the unit test cases, here in this particular implementation, right, we are just panicking if we are not entering a value which is outside the boundary of 1 to 100. So in this particular unit test cases, right, here if you see all the test code should be added using hash within parenthesis test, and we know this particular code will panic because we are passing 200. So we can add this should panic thing, and we are expected to have this particular output here. Like that, we can add and all that. So also we can also have asset equals, and we can also say ignore, because when there is an expensive test which is happening, right, probably you can disable those tests by using ignore. So there is one thing. And anonymous, so what is closures? Closures are anonymous functions can save in a variable and pass to another function. So for closures, right, it normally having a couple of pipe symbols, and closures will have, with single parameter will be looking like this, and with the multiple parameter will be looking like this. So quickly we'll go through a use case where closures are very useful. So if you see, we are just simulating in the expense calculation. Here it's a costly operation. We are waiting for 2 seconds here. And if you see, there is a workout, how many push-ups you have done and everything. They are doing a costly operation before hand, and they're using it here, here, and here. But in case intensity is greater than 25 and the random number is 3, right? Again, we are for this also we are using this. We are unnecessarily running this particular expense calculation. So in order to avoid that, this particular feature will be useful post closure. So we'll look into the solution. So here we are just declaring a closure within the enum where intensity is the parameter, and then we are just declaring it. We are not using it, so it doesn't run this particular function. And wherever needed, we have used it. You can also optimize it by assigning it to some variable and then use it here. But so here, if when this particular statement get executed, right, it will be faster. So that is the advantage here. And for smart pointers, like if you see, there is a few smart pointers which we can use. Box of t, which is a generic thing. If you want to store a variable like integer variable or something in heap, right, you can use this box. Box of box new or 5, it will allocate the memory for this integer in heap. And also there's a small example where you can, if you don't use box here, if you are just using list, it will do a stack overflow here, and because it will continue already pointing to list continuously. And so in order to avoid that, if you use the box, right, it will allocate in heap, and until the point of nil, there will be a list which is created. Similarly for RC, RC is the reference counting, tracks the number of references in a single thread. This is all for single threaded. Reference cell and reference counting are single thread. It cannot be used for multi-thread applications. That is something which we need to remember. Here, RC clone doesn't mean that it's a deep copy. Normally, when you want to do a deep copy of a string, right, you will use that string dot clone or something, so that it will do a deep copy in heap. So here it doesn't represent deep copy, it just adds a reference count. So that's what the sample is about. So probably quickly go through a sample. Here, so here to understand what is a reference count, right? We'll just run this and see. So if you see, after creating this A, we are having the strong count as 1, and then after assigning that particular A to B, we are having we are cloning it, and then assigning it, so that now the count is 2. And C, if you notice, C is inside a nested loop, and then at that point, the reference count of A is 3, and after this point, right, it is supposed to free the memory, right? It is reduce reference count. So after this point, if you try to print C A, right, it will show 2. So this is what it is, and we'll quickly go through the other sample as well. Where this particular ref cell, right, this is useful when you want to mutate the value, even if it is immutable. So if for immutable value also, you can actually mutate it if you are declaring it as a ref cell. So that's what we are going to see here. So it's declared as a ref cell, and then here, if you see, we are actually cloning it, and the main thing is here. So you probably can ignore all that, but after we create all that value and everything, we are able to change that value here. Change the value by using a borrow mute inside this ref cell functionality. So here we are adding the value of 10. Initially, it is like 5, right? 5. The value is 5, and then we are adding 10 to it. So let's see what is the value it's get printed across all the values in the list. So if you see 15 get reflected in all the places. This is single threaded. And now coming to fearless concurrency. So concurrency is like running a multiple piece of code at the same time, and transferring within this multiple thread using, there are two ways we can do concurrency, like when message passing concurrency, which is like using channels, and shared state concurrency is also possible using mutex locking and unlocking. So the data can be shared across threads. So we'll quickly see a sample for channels. So in this case, we are implementing we are inheriting this, importing this particular standard library, MPSE, which is like multiple producer, single consumer. So so here it returns transmitter and receiver. So transmitter, you can clone any number of times. You can have multiple clones and then pass it to the particular thread value to send a particular channel. So if you see here, we are creating a vector, and just in the for loop, we are sending each and every string into this particular channel. Similarly, there is a parallel thread which is running, which also has its own string, and then in a for loop, we are continuously sending using the default tx value, and then we are sending it. So if you run this code, it will be able to run it in parallel, and you can get the value in so the nested values. So we will also go to another sample. This is about channels, and for if you want to use the shared resource, right, you have to use the combination of mutex and arc. So in this case, right, if you see, we are what we are trying to do is, we are in a particular for loop, we are creating 10 different threads, and we are trying to use this particular shared resource counter and trying to increment it by 1. So even though 10 resource access this particular data, it should not have different values. It should ideally have the value of 10. That's the aim. So if you see this lock functionality, right, it returns a mutable value. So that's why we are able to increment this particular number. So if you see, we can get the value 10. Quickly, we'll change a little bit to see if you use RC, what happens. So it will clearly say, the compiler will clearly tell you, cannot be sending between its thread safety, because we are spanning the thread here, and then RC mutex cannot be sent between threads safely. So it's able to clearly, the compiler will clearly able to guide you about this information. And this is about the topics which I have skipped: encapsulation and untrusted code. We can write C code inside this, and probably deployment we didn't cover, so probably we'll do it in the next session. So that's it. Thank you for the opportunity.
Cool, Raja. Thank
questions?
you. And I'm sure this is more than a basic for sure, and a lot of code people hooked into, and we didn't realize the time. I want to open up still for any questions for folks who are connected virtual and people here as well.
Sorry if I missed in the flow, but one quick question I had is, I heard, of course, Rust doesn't have like garbage collection.
Yeah.
Or it doesn't at least have a background. There's no background garbage collection.
Yeah.
Right? So how does it actually work? Like, what happens to the heap memory when it goes out of scope?
Actually, whenever it goes out of scope, right, the drop trait will be implemented. So the drop trait will take the functionality of cleaning up the resource for each and every resource which is created in the heap.
So
we
it
can
runs
also
on the same thread as the function, not
Yes.
a background garbage collector.
You can also explicitly call drop functionality if you want, but it's not recommended.
But when you forget to drop, or if the scope is such that it
cannot
stays
do-
through the program execution, then it
Yeah.
could cause memory leak, right? So it's still
We
programmer's
can do
responsibility to-
memory leak. How we can do it, like the reference counting code and all, right? If you have two resources and the first resource pointing to the second one, the second resource pointing to the third one, it will keep allocating, and it will be a memory leak. But explicitly, if we do it also, the compiler will be brilliant enough to tell you that if you do this, it is not possible.
Not possible.
So you have to fight with the compiler to write a beautiful code. So that's
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? I think nothing from virtual participants as well. Cool. I hope you will share this presentation to all. It'll serve as a primer for all of us to go through and definitely learn a lot about Rust. Thanks,
Yeah, sure.
Raja. Thanks for taking us through Rust.
Yeah,
And
thank you.
thanks, Praveen, as well,
Yeah.
for coming over and sharing your.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks to both of you. So thanks everybody who had joined us virtual, and hope we'll be able to see you sometime soon in our next meetup when we host it
எங்க
again
இருக்கும்?
here in this office space. Thank you all. Thanks. Bye.
ஓ இங்க இருக்கு. ஓகே, ஸ்டாப் ஷேரிங் பண்ணிட்டேன்.
Yeah, good. Thank you, man. I know it's a lot of regulation. I was asking you to see if you can make this here and maybe sit down because you were standing there for a long time. Oh, find a way to push this PC there, but it's a long cabling. Oh. Thanks, man. There's a lot of content. I think people who had some initial overview might be able to, but it's still good.